Hello, my name is Bethel Israel, and I'm a research assistant under the Youth Health and Development Lab directed by Dr. Aerika Loyd. And so with their support, I wanted to look into mental health and psychological well-being among diverse college students. To go down is the next slide. Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So I found in research that college students tend to struggle with their mental health, and yet they are less likely to seek mental health treatments when compared to their white peers. And so an example of an experience that is more specific and relative to minority groups is ethnic discrimination. And so ethnic discrimination is known to be associated with increasing depressive and anxious symptoms. And so I wanted to examine the differences and associations between mental health and psychological well-being in these diverse college students. And so I also wanted to note that it's extremely significant to know about mental health and to study it because it helps us have a better understanding on how to help others. And so a lot of minority groups may not have had in the past the tools and the understanding on how to best navigate their mental health and know exactly where their resources are, where their support is, and how to understand how to help themselves specifically. So I used data from the multi-site university study of identity and culture, which is really long, but it's otherwise known as the music study. And so there were over 3,000 participants from 30 universities across the nation. And so with that, there were ages range from 18 to 29, with an average age of 19. And the procedure included participants just completing an online survey. And so as you can see from the pie chart, 30% identified as Asian American, 26% identified as Black African American, and 44% identified as Latinx Hispanic. So there were measures that we took from the multi-site university study. These were the self-esteem scale, the depression scale, the anxiety inventory scale, the social anxiety scale, the psychological well-being, and the perceived ability scale. Oh, sorry. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to look into were associations between depressive symptoms and psychological well-being. So with this, I found negative correlations with all three racial ethnic groups in this scale, which basically means that as depressive symptoms would increase, psychological well-being would decrease. And then I also looked into associations between perceived vulnerability and self-esteem, and I only found negative correlations with two of the racial ethnic groups, so in Black and Hispanic participants, where again, it essentially means that as perceived vulnerability would increase, self-esteem would decrease. And so I also looked into differences in depressive and anxious symptoms, social anxiety, and self-esteem. And with that, I found statistically significant differences in depressive symptoms, social anxiety, and self-esteem, whereas I didn't find any statistically significant differences in anxious symptoms. I also wanted to take it a step further, and as you can see from the bar chart, I wanted to look into the mean differences within these groups. And so I found that Black and Hispanic participants actually scored higher on their self-esteem, whereas East Asian participants scored a little higher in depressive symptoms and social anxiety. So essentially what these results tell me is that it's not only important to have mental health resources that are accessible to racial ethnic minority college students, but to have these services consider the perspectives and experiences that these minority college students go through on their campuses, and for also to have counseling centers that are more culturally informed with their practices in order to create a more safer environment for them to access their mental health resources and decrease the stigma around mental health in general. And hopefully in the future, it would increase the rate of the amount of racial ethnic minority college students actually accessing the resources that they have on their campuses. And then a possible limitation that I would consider is the possibility of having measures more culturally sensitive so that in the future, it's not as likely for them to be underestimating the mental health symptoms that a lot of minority groups go through in their studies. And then in the future, I would love to look into gender differences within these groups and also see how family dynamics and ethnic identity also impacts their mental health and their experiences while they're in college. So these are my references. And then overall, I would just like to say a special thank you to LeNisha Williams and Dr. Aerika Loyd for helping me with this presentation. Any questions?
I'm kind of tying this question partially back into previous presentations.
Yes.
So you looked at I think you said 20 colleges or so across the nation?
30. 30.
In which so the different colleges will have different distributions of ethnicity. So how do you think, say you look at a historically Black university, where there's going to be a much different distribution, how might this impact outreach as well as mental health? Like, is there going to be a higher degree of reaching out, or going to the last presentation, do you think there will also be some stigma that gets reinforced within this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. So I think that if there's like research that looks into HBCUs, that hopefully the idea would be to see how their perspectives are on mental health. And like I said before, previously, in a lot of racial ethnic minority groups, the idea of mental health and the concept around it isn't as always accepted and seen as a stigma. So I think, and overall, it should be generally just an equal amount of just pursuing pursuing more of a more culturally informed practices in any and all schools, just so that it helps decrease the stigma all around. So yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Do you think there will be a difference between maybe first generation immigrant and second generation immigrant college students? For example, like social migrant, and you could be born in America and you also could be born outside of America.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting thing to look into in the future, seeing how like cultural differences as you go into looking into differences between first gen and second gen, how maybe their parents may not have had access or information in general in their native countries on how mental health is and how to navigate it, and that may not have been interpreted to their kids. Whereas maybe in parents who are first generation who have lived here and grown up here, since America is generally a little bit more open to talking about mental health, maybe they have a little bit more tools and a little bit better understanding, so that second generation students may have at least a basis of understanding their mental health. And I think that's something interesting to look forward to in the future.
I think we can tailor different accesses to mental health among different minority groups.
Sorry,
I think we can tailor different access to mental health among minority groups, like possibly advertising, especially on not all minority groups would be you can use the same advertising mental health might be different among groups.
For sure. I think that a lot of college campuses have resource centers. So like with UCR, for example, we have different ethnic group resources. So we have ASP and we have one for the Chicanos population as well. So I think more or less sort of advertising it within those groups, because those tend to be where resources are popularized and promoted, just so that each group can sort of have a better understanding and they're more likely to tell their friends as well.
So a lot of perceived invulnerability, I believe, in your presentation. So I was curious as to how you think that perceived invulnerability is impacted by differences in cultural values between families and the POC youth.
Oh, nice. Okay, so that's a good question. So for those of you who don't know what perceived invulnerability means, it's essentially where someone may think that they are invincible to the behaviors that are considered risky. So like alcohol abuse or driving really fast and swerving around in cars and stuff like that. So basically, I do not know. I think that would be really interesting to look into in the future. I didn't really know much about perceived invulnerability. It's sort of the measure in this study that is the outlier, I guess, out of the other measures that are more like known to be associated with mental health. And so I just wanted to see how it would relate in general, just because it's something I've never known about and never considered. But I really like that question, and I would really want to look into that in the future for sure.
Good then.
Okay.